He beat thyroid cancer. He beat prostate cancer. He made it through COVID-19, a global pandemic that shut down the entire music industry for nearly 2 years and claimed voices that were younger, stronger, and less worn than his. He has endured 81 years of living at an intensity that would break most men within 2 decades. And last Thursday evening, just hours before he was set to take the stage at the Coliseum inside Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Rod Stewart, Knight of the Realm, rock and roll survivor, the most viscerally powerful voice of his era, was told by his physician to rest his voice completely. Not cancer this time, not a cardiac scare, not a fall, not the gradual physical deterioration that aging eventually forces upon every human being regardless of how famously they've worn their years. A sinus infection, vocal rest. 2 simple medical instructions that in virtually any other career would be trivial. 2 instructions that in Rod Stewart's world mean absolutely everything. Because without that voice, there is no Rod Stewart. There never has been. The voice was always the foundation, the story, the whole of it. He canceled Thursday. He canceled Friday. He posted an apology to what he genuinely and without a trace of irony calls his family of fans. Then he announced he would be back on stage on June 2nd, today. Which brings us to the only question that truly matters at this moment. The question that no one in Rod Stewart's inner circle wants to say out loud. How many more times can a man who has already outlasted everything ask his body to give him one more night? There is one version of Rod Stewart's story that starts with glamour. The version featuring leopard print jackets and platinum records and supermodel companions and stadium crowds singing every word back at him as though the lyrics had been written about their own lives, which in many ways they always had been. Rod Stewart wrote about longing and heartbreak and desire and that particular ache of reaching for something just slightly beyond your grasp. And he wrote it so convincingly that an entire generation concluded he had been writing specifically about them. That version of the story is true. But it is not where the story begins. The story begins in Highgate, North London, on the 10th of January 1945, the 5th child born to Robert Joseph Stewart and Elsie Gilbert. A working-class family in the very specific way that working class meant something real in post-war Britain, not the romanticized poverty of cinema, not the noble struggle of fiction, but the quiet, relentless calculation of stretching what little you had until more arrived. Rod grew up in a household where football was treated like a religion and music was simply part of the background. Always present, always on. His father played the harmonica. The radio was never turned off. Nobody in that household could have imagined that the youngest boy, the one with straw-colored hair and a voice that seemed oddly oversized for his young frame, would one day sell more than 250 million albums around the world. Nobody imagines that. It never happens the way you'd predict. What Rod had from the very start was a rare combination. A vocal instrument of almost irrational natural power and an absolute unwillingness to settle for being ordinary. He tried football first. Of course he did. This is, after all, Scotland's most passionate English supporter. A man who eventually built a full-scale football pitch on his own property, who travels the globe in tartan, who has spent decades pouring money and devotion into Scottish football with an almost religious dedication. Football was the original dream. Music was the happy accident that turned into destiny. By the early 1960s, Rod was playing in small bands, practicing harmonica on trains and street corners, soaking up every piece of American blues he could get his hands on. He discovered Muddy Waters. He discovered Sam Cooke. He found the raw, unapologetic honesty in voices that made no excuses for themselves. He absorbed everything he heard and sent it through whatever extraordinary thing lived inside his throat. What emerged on the other side was something the world had not heard before, rough and tender and urgent, a voice that sounded as though it had already lived through everything it was about to sing. By 1971, Maggie May had made Rod Stewart the most recognizable voice on earth. By 1978, Do You Think I'm Sexy? Had turned him into a cultural force that reached far beyond music. By 1989, Have I Told You Lately? Demonstrated that the same voice could carry quiet tenderness just as powerfully as it had always carried raw desire. More than 60 years of that voice doing things human voices simply aren't supposed to sustain. Which is precisely why what happened in the year 2000 was so much more than a medical event. It was the first time the world was forced to confront the possibility that the voice could actually be taken away. In May of 2000, Rod Stewart sat in a doctor's office and received a diagnosis that most people would have announced immediately, if only to explain the silence that followed. Thyroid cancer. The thyroid gland rests at the base of the throat, a small, butterfly-shaped organ measuring roughly 5 centimeters across in a healthy adult. It governs metabolism, energy levels, and body temperature. It performs a quiet, essential function within the body that most people never think about until something goes wrong. For a singer, the location alone is enough to cause deep dread. The thyroid sits directly next to the structures responsible for producing the human voice, the larynx, the vocal cords, the intricate network of nerves that manages the entire mechanical process of making sound. Thyroid surgery carries a well-documented and specific risk: damage to the recurrent laryngeal nerve, the nerve that controls the vocal cords. Even minor damage to that nerve alters the voice. Severe damage silences it permanently. For most patients, that is one devastating possibility among several. For Rod Stewart, it was the only one that mattered. He underwent surgery to remove the tumor. The operation succeeded. The cancer was gone. And Rod Stewart did something that, in retrospect, reveals almost everything about how he processes fear. He said almost nothing publicly for years. Not out of shame, not out of denial, but out of a very particular kind of privacy belonging to men who have learned somewhere along the way that the sympathy of the world carries a weight all its own, and that bearing it can sometimes be heavier than bearing the fear in silence. He recovered fully by every medical measure. The voice survived the surgeon's hands. The instrument that had defined 6 decades of music came through the operating room intact. Rougher, perhaps, in the way that everything Rod Stewart touches eventually becomes rougher and more real, but intact. He went back on stage. He recorded. He toured. He did what Rod Stewart has always done. When the world gives him a reason to stop, he declines. But here is what nobody knew yet. Here is what Rod Stewart was already carrying in silence. 6 years after the thyroid surgery, 6 years after the first cancer had passed without the public ever truly grasping what it had meant. In 2016, during a routine medical checkup, his doctors discovered something new: prostate cancer. And this time, Rod Stewart told no one. Not his fans, not the media, not the public that had bought his records and packed his venues and given him, across 6 decades, a kind of devotion that very few artists ever receive and almost none know how to hold without letting it slip. For 3 years, he carried it entirely alone. What does a man do with a secret that large? And why, when he finally chose to speak, did he choose a cancer fundraiser in Dublin on a Tuesday evening in 2019 to say the words aloud for the very first time? There is a particular kind of courage in keeping a secret. And there is a different kind of courage, quieter, more costly, and in many ways harder to summon, in deciding to end one. On a Tuesday evening in November 2019, Rod Stewart stood before a room of people gathered for a gala in support of the Irish Cancer Society in Dublin. He was there as a supporter, a celebrity lending his name and presence to a deserving cause. He had attended hundreds of events exactly like this one. He knew the format perfectly. You arrive, you smile, you say the appropriate things, and you leave. Instead, Rod Stewart stepped up to the microphone and told the room he had prostate cancer, had, past tense, already in remission since July of 2019, for months before that evening in Dublin. The battle, by the time he spoke of it publicly, had already been won. Which raises a question with no clean answer. Did he wait until he was safe before speaking because he genuinely didn't want to cause worry, as he himself said, or because speaking while the outcome was still uncertain would have required a vulnerability that even Rod Stewart, after 81 years of living loudly, could not yet bring himself to offer? Probably both. Most true things are probably both. What he said in that room in Dublin was simple and direct in the way that only things carried for a very long time can become when they are finally set down. I should have spoken about it sooner. I just didn't want to worry anyone. 3 years. 3 years of touring, recording, performing, appearing on stage in front of tens of thousands of people, wearing the suits, delivering the voice, being Rod Stewart completely and without any visible interruption, while living privately with a prostate cancer diagnosis his doctors had given him in 2016. 3 years of shows at Caesar's Palace, 3 years of standing ovations, 3 years of Maggie May and Have I Told You Lately and Do You Think I'm Sexy? Filling arenas, while the man singing them was quietly, privately fighting for his life in the hours between curtain calls. The diagnosis had come early. That made an enormous difference. Prostate cancer detected at an early stage carries 5-year survival rates approaching 98 and 99% in otherwise healthy patients. Early detection is not a minor factor. It is frequently the entire difference between a story that ends in remission and one that doesn't end at all. Rod Stewart understood this deeply, which is why, standing in that room in Dublin having survived what he'd survived, he said something that cut straight through every rock and roll mythology he'd ever built around himself and landed with the full weight of a man who had genuinely been afraid. He told the men in that room to get tested, not as a polished public service announcement, not as a celebrity endorsement of a campaign, but as a man who had lived with his own diagnosis for 3 years and finally arrived at the understanding that the silence he had chosen, the silence he had believed was protecting the people who loved him, had also been the most dangerous thing he could have offered every other man watching him from the audience that evening. "Get tested," he said. "It saved my life." For words. No production, no musical arrangement, no legendary voice lifting them to any great dramatic height. Just a man in a room in Dublin telling the plain truth about what it costs to have almost not been here. The applause that followed was the quiet kind. Not the kind that celebrates, but the kind that understands. He was back on stage the following week. He hasn't stopped since. 2020 brought COVID-19 and the enforced silence it placed on every live performance in the world. Rod Stewart, like every artist of his generation, went still not by choice but by necessity. When venues reopened, he was among the first to return. When tours resumed, his name was on them. By 2024, he was performing his 200th show at Caesars Palace, a milestone in residency history that almost no artist at that venue had ever reached. He tested positive for COVID-19 that same year and canceled dates. He recovered and came back in August 2024. A streptococcal throat infection forced another cancellation. He recovered and returned in June 2025. Illness pulled him off stage again. First a general feeling of being unwell, then a doctor's instruction to rest while recovering from influenza. Shows in Las Vegas, Lake Tahoe, and California were affected. He recovered. He returned. There is a pattern here. And it is not a pattern that frightens his management or his medical team any less for being familiar. Patterns in medicine are not reassuring simply because they keep repeating. Sometimes a pattern is a warning that has already been issued multiple times and is simply getting harder to ignore. The body of an 81-year-old man, even one as extraordinarily well-maintained as Rod Stewart's, even one that exercises regularly, watches what it eats, and has withstood 2 cancers, a pandemic, and 6 decades of the specific physical punishment that life on the road delivers, is not the same body that recorded Maggie May in 1971. Cannot be. That is not failure. That is simply what time does. And so the question that nobody close to Rod Stewart wants to ask directly, the question that hovers over every canceled show, every medical statement, every carefully worded press release, is this: at what point does the pattern of recoveries become something else entirely? Thursday, May 29, 2026. The Coliseum at Caesars Palace holds 4,296 people. It is not the largest room Rod Stewart has ever played. Not even remotely. He has filled Wembley Stadium. He has performed for hundreds of thousands at free concerts on Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro, events that entered the record books as among the most heavily attended in the history of live music. He has stood on stages so enormous that people in the furthest rows could only make out his silhouette. By those standards, the Coliseum at Caesars Palace is intimate. But intimacy at this stage of Rod Stewart's career is not a concession. It is a deliberate decision. The residency model, returning to the same stage, the same city, building a relationship with an audience that reserves tickets months in advance specifically to see him in a room small enough to feel the collective energy in it, represents something Rod Stewart has earned and chosen quite intentionally. This is not an artist filling arenas because demand requires it. This is an artist who has made a conscious decision about how he wants to spend whatever stage time remains to him, which is precisely what gives the events of Thursday, May 29, 2026, their particular gravity. Just hours before the curtain was due to rise, the announcement came. Rod Stewart had been ordered by his doctor to cancel. A sinus infection, vocal rest, mandatory, non-negotiable. The statement from his representative was measured and precise in the way that statements from people managing a difficult situation always are. Following his doctor's advice, Rod Stewart has regretfully canceled his performances at the Coliseum at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas on May 29th and 30th, but is scheduled to return with shows beginning June 2nd. 4,000 people had tickets for Thursday night, 4,000 more for Friday. And Rod Stewart, the man who has stood on more stages in more countries across more decades than almost any other living artist, the man who once told a Dublin audience that a cancer diagnosis had never stopped him from doing what he loved, the man who had come back after COVID-19 and strep and influenza and thyroid surgery and prostate cancer and every other obstacle that 81 years of living had placed in front of him, was at home, silent, on doctor's orders. His personal message to his fans was brief, and in its brevity it carried everything that brevity sometimes carries when a man not normally given to it chooses it anyway. My apologies to my family of fans. I am on vocal rest as I recover from a sinus infection. I look forward to seeing you at a future show at Caesars Palace or on tour this summer. Read it once and it sounds like a standard cancellation notice. Read it again slowly and something else comes through. The apology is not performative. My family of fans is not a phrase Rod Stewart reaches for as a branding tool. He has used it for decades, in interviews, in liner notes, in offhand remarks that were never intended for public consumption. It is genuinely how he thinks about the people who have followed him across 6 decades of music. The apology is personal. And the forward-looking line, I look forward to seeing you at a future show at Caesars Palace or on tour this summer, is not the boilerplate reassurance of a publicist. It is a man in his 81st year, ordered into silence by his physician, already turning his thoughts toward the next stage, the next night, the next room full of people waiting for him to walk out and do what he has been doing since before most of them were born. He is scheduled to return today, June 2nd, 2026. Tonight, additional shows follow on June 4th and June 6th. The residency resumes in August, the 18th through the 29th, before the North American tour continues through the summer, concluding on August 15th in Kansas City. European dates follow: Lisbon on June 27th, Valencia on June 30th, Bassano del Grappa on July 2nd. The calendar is packed. The body is 81 years old. Both of these things are simultaneously true. Both occupy the same space without canceling the other out, which is perhaps the most honest summary of Rod Stewart's entire life that anyone could offer. Things that should not be simultaneously true somehow are. He survived thyroid cancer. He survived prostate cancer. He survived COVID-19. He survived strep and influenza and the cumulative toll of 6 decades on the road and the specific and particular loneliness of carrying 2 cancer diagnoses in private while delivering joy to millions of strangers from a stage every night. A sinus infection stopped him for 3 days and he is already mapping out the next show. There is something in that specific fact. Not the cancer survivals, not the stadium attendance records, not the knighthood or the album sales or the football pitch in his garden or the model train collection reportedly valued at over $1 million. There is something in that one specific, ordinary, almost absurdly mundane fact that contains the full truth of who Rod Stewart is. A sinus infection stopped him for 3 days. 3 days. Not permanently. Not forever. Not in the way the cancers could have stopped him. Not in the way the surgeries could have stopped him. Not in the way that time itself, slowly, patiently, inevitably, is narrowing the distance between the man and the silence that eventually waits at the end of every story. 3 days. And then the curtain rises again. Because the only question that has ever truly mattered, the only question Rod Stewart has been answering with his body and his voice and his refusal to disappear for more than 6 decades, is not whether the pain is real or whether the age is showing or whether the accumulating pattern of cancellations deserves more serious attention than it has been given. The only question is whether the love is still there. And every time he walks back out onto that stage, Rod Stewart answers it exactly the way he always has, without a single word. There is an image that lives in the memory of everyone who has ever watched Rod Stewart perform live. It doesn't matter which decade, which tour, which venue. Whether the stage was inside a stadium holding 100,000 people or a theater holding 4,000. The image is always the same. A man at the microphone, head tilted slightly back, eyes closed or nearly so, the voice arriving from somewhere deeper than the throat, deeper than technique, deeper than 60 years of accumulated craft and professional mastery. It arrives from somewhere that has no clinical name. Rod Stewart turns 82 in January of 2027. He has 8 children. He has been married to Penny Lancaster since 2007, a marriage that has long outlasted the skepticism of everyone who doubted it and quietly become one of the more remarkable partnerships in the life of a man not previously celebrated for remarkable partnerships. He has a football pitch in his garden. He has a model train collection that most grown men would be moved to tears to stand inside. He has a knighthood, Sir Rod Stewart, awarded in 2016 by a monarchy that does not typically bestow such honors on men who once buskied on street corners and slept in the backs of vans on the way to gigs that paid almost nothing. By any reasonable measure, he has more than enough. And yet, the 2026 North American Arena and Amphitheater Tour opened on May 13th in Connecticut. It runs through August 15th in Kansas City. European dates follow: Lisbon, Valencia, Bassano del Grappa. The Caesars Palace residency returns in August. The calendar stretches forward with the quiet confidence of a man who simply does not entertain the possibility that the next show might be his last, which is either the most inspiring thing about Rod Stewart or the most heartbreaking, depending on which version of love you subscribe to. There are people close to him, people who have watched the cancellations accumulate over the past 2 years, who have tallied the medical statements, who have done the quiet arithmetic of age and illness and the specific toll that a life on the road takes on a body that is no longer young, who carry a private worry that never finds its way into press releases or social media updates or the carefully maintained public narrative of unstoppable resilience. They worry because they love him, and love at this particular distance, in this particular chapter of a life this long and this loudly lived, has a very specific texture. It is not the love of the early years, when worry was something abstract and the future felt vast and the idea of Rod Stewart being anything other than exactly what he was seemed genuinely impossible. It is the love that knows better now. The love that has sat with 2 cancer diagnoses and a pandemic and a growing frequency of cancellations and arrived at the understanding that whatever time remains, however many more shows the voice and the body can still deliver, is not endless. Nothing is endless. Not even Rod Stewart. But here is what 81 years on a stage actually looks like from the inside, as best as anyone who is not Rod Stewart can describe it. It looks like choosing to go back. Every single time. After every cancellation, after every medical order, after every period of enforced silence, it looks like choosing to go back. Not because stopping would be failure. Not because the identity demands it. Not because Rod Stewart without a stage is somehow less than Rod Stewart with one. But because the love is still there, the love for the song, the love for the room, the love for that specific and irreplaceable exchange that takes place when a voice that has survived everything it has survived meets an audience that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to hear it one more time. That exchange cannot be replicated. It cannot be streamed or archived or preserved in any form that retains the full weight of the original. It happens live in real time between a man and the people who showed up to share that room with him, and then it is over. And the only way to have it again is to come back. Rod Stewart keeps coming back. Tonight, if the voice holds and the body cooperates and the sinus infection has retreated far enough to allow it, tonight, at the Coliseum at Caesars Palace, the curtain will rise. 4,000 people will be in their seats. And somewhere in the wings, in the particular silence that exists in the moment just before a performer steps into the light, Rod Stewart will be standing in the dark. 81 years old. 2 cancers behind him. A sinus infection 3 days behind him. An entire life behind him. And he will walk out anyway. He always does. If this story has moved you, if you have ever stood in a room while that voice filled it, or if you simply believe that a man who has survived everything deserves to be seen clearly rather than merely celebrated, leave a comment below. Tell us what Rod Stewart means to you. Tell us which song. Tell us which night. Tell us whatever it is you've been carrying that his music helped you carry. And if you know someone who has been putting off a medical check, someone who, like Rod Stewart himself once did, is carrying something in silence that doesn't need to be carried alone, share this with them. Early detection saved his life. Can save someone else's too. The stage is lit. The room is waiting. Sir Rod Stewart, go show them what 81 looks like when it refuses to be quiet. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Rod Stewart has been making music for more than 60 years. 60 years of songs that found people at exactly the right moment. On a late-night drive, in a kitchen on a Sunday morning, at a wedding, at a funeral, in a car with the windows down, heading somewhere that felt like everything. Somewhere in that catalog, there is a song that belongs to you. Maybe it's Maggie May, that raw, aching confession from a young man who lost something he wasn't sure he deserved to keep. Maybe it's Have I Told You Lately, 3 minutes and 42 seconds of tenderness so complete that entire relationships have been defined by it. Maybe it's Sailing or Forever Young, or The First Cut is the Deepest, or something from deep in the catalog that most people have never heard but that you have quietly carried for years like something privately owned. Whatever it is, tell us. Drop it in the comments right now. The song title alone or the memory that goes with it, or both. And while you're there, tell us where in the world you're watching this from tonight. Your city, your country, your corner of the world that Rod Stewart's voice has somehow managed to reach across 6 decades and find. We read every single comment, every one. This channel exists because of the people in that comment section. And tonight, we want to know exactly who's in the room. What is your Rod Stewart song? And where in the world are you watching from? Tell us below.